Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to listen to my fairly short presentation, hopefully. My name's Lorna Saunder. I'm a senior lecturer in mental health nursing and addictions from City University of London, and coming to speak at this conference at an engineering school feels a little bit like landing on planet Mars, because it's so far from my world that it all feels very, very different at the moment. But in terms of kind of introducing what we've been doing and maybe putting it a little bit into context, is probably seen across papers and what have you. People with mental health problems, people with learning disabilities have on average between a 10 and 20 years shorter expected lifespan, mainly as a consequence of issues around things like diagnostic overshadowing, which is the misunderstanding of clinical symptoms and misinterpreting those as mental health symptoms, but also around the issues around compassion and empathy towards people that suffer from mental health conditions and learning disabilities. So that's kind of where some of this work has really come from, and is what the importance of this work is about. In the spirit of a VR conference, I'm co-presenting with my co-presenter, who is co-presenting from Australia because she dared to go and leave me and moved over to Australia. This is Leona Norris, who is very confusing when you're working on a project with a Lorna and Leona. It caused much confusion, but I will allow her to introduce herself.
Australia, everyone. I would have loved to have been there with you all, but as I'm now working at Monash University in Melbourne, it's a bit far to commute. However, before I left, I was lucky enough to work with Lorna to develop her grand vision. So instead today, I'll be adding some tidbits to Lorna's live action, and will watch along with you all on the virtual feed. I hope you enjoy.
So we had done quite a little bit of work around developing experiences to multimedia experiences, particularly around the work of understanding learning disability and how to help people with learning disabilities through health services. And we kind of happened upon VR kind of about sort of 5 or 6 years ago and started to think about what we could do with it. Lots of it has been enrolled around the more kind of technical skills. We know it's very embodied in engineering, medicine, aviation, simulators, medicine, but they're very much kind of physical skills, laparoscopes, flying planes, those kinds of things. But we were really interested in how VR could actually work on those more soft skills that are so important in delivering healthcare. There's also been more data starting to emerge now around the use of VR in helping people to recreate experiences therapeutically. So around social phobias, there's the kind of experience of being arachnophobia and social anxiety. So recreating virtual environments for people that are too scared to leave the house, too scared to go out. You can create these VR experiences through sort of graded exposure. For those of us with a psychology background will be familiar with that. So helping people to familiarise themselves with the environment and hopefully thereby reducing the anxiety. So we really wanted to use VR to kind of tap into those two areas that were already in existence. It really was a case of kind of right time, right tech in terms of Samsung gear coming along. The early VR projects often required enormous labs with huge screens and massive amounts of investment. There's a study done by, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Weimer. It was done using a converted shipping container. Sadly, in the centre of London, there's not a lot of space for converted shipping containers to create VR type environments. And they created a VR environment to recreate the experience of having dementia and being lost in your own environment. So we didn't have that kind of money. We had a very, very limited budget. So we looked at lots of different medium to use VR. Discounted the Oculus Rift. It was too big, it was too expensive, and we wanted something that we could use that was lightweight and portable, and the Samsung gear very much helped us to do that.
So instead of requiring a high-end computer with a tethered headset and expensive software development, we could instead leverage high-end mobile phones with lightweight portable headsets and less expensive software development. This meant that Lorna's grand vision was feasible within a relatively modest budget, meaning most importantly for Lorna, it would require minimal setup and on the
One of the other things that we actually found out, and for those of you who work maybe in quite multicultural and diverse environments, is the Samsung gear will fit over a headscarf, which was really, really important for us with our students to be able to accommodate everybody. It fitted over glasses, but these were one of the kind of sort of findings that we had that came out was rather unexpectedly. So what we wanted to do, our learning outcome that we set up, was that we wanted to recreate the ability to view social situations through the lens of mental health disturbance. We wanted to recreate the idea of that sense of walking in somebody else's shoes, but seeing through somebody else's shoes, through eyes, not through their shoes, through their eyes. And how that would interfere with typical communication. So it's all well and good learning a list of diagnoses, it's all well and good learning a list of symptoms, but until you know how that's actually going to interfere with your day-to-day functioning, empathy becomes quite difficult to develop. You might know it academically, you might know it intellectually, but we needed to get students to be able to feel those experiences. We wanted to be able to experience those emotional effects, and then what we wanted our students to do was to take that feeling and take that experience and then be able to apply it to, well, you know, you're trying to give someone instructions how to get to X-ray. How are you going to do that if somebody's psychotic and hearing voices? If you're trying to give somebody information about how they need to manage their diet, how are you going to do that with somebody who's feeling depressed and hopeless and worthless? What might they have running in their head at the time that you're trying to give that information to them? And how do you need to adapt your communication based on that emotional experience and that learning? So we came up with City View. We've got a lovely little snappy title, not my invention, which was City Virtual Immersive Educational World, which came out as City View, which fitted very nicely. That's courtesy of Sandra Partington. I think it's here virtually somewhere today. And we started very much at the beginning, which Danae said earlier. City University is a real leader in involving service users in the development of curriculum, educational resources. All of the services that we provide has our service user right at the beginning. And for those of you who may not quite so familiar with the term, that's people who've got lived experience, in this case, of mental health conditions. So we started working with them right at the beginning. We had some people that had experience of psychosis, people that had experience of depression. We also had a working group of students because we wanted to make sure that what we were delivering was going to be something that was relevant. So we had a working party, which I think surprised our media partners because they had obviously never worked with people with active mental health issues before, and they were quite surprised at some of the level of revelations that were coming up and the openness that people were happy to talk about their own mental health experiences. So I think they had a bit of a learning curve around some of the things that we talked about. So the service user voice was we were passionate that had to be heard and that had to be included. So we decided the best way to do this was to create a 360-degree film, and we wanted to look at different mental health experiences of mania, psychosis, anxiety, and depression. And this is where the budget limits started to come in. I had a tiny budget. It was, you know, in terms of research grants, minute. So we were very limited in terms of what we could develop. So what we ended up was with this, with using the headset, was we had 4 films that the students could choose to watch. But what we did was, because of budget constraints, we had the same film, but we overlaid different effects onto it to make sure that we adapted it for each different particular situation. So what we created was the world's most ghastly party. And again, this is when one hands over creative control to an external. You don't necessarily end up with quite what you had in mind all of the time. And my definition, I think, of diversity appeared to be quite different from our designers, because we really wanted to create a kind of socially diverse situation. So the wearer goes in, puts the headset on, looks around the party, and there's various bits of text that start to come down from the screen. And those texts indicate the person's thoughts, one of the things that we kind of came across was how on earth do you convey somebody else's thoughts as your own? And we looked at using audio, but the difficulty there is our own internal dialogue is our own voice. Therefore, if you want to create somebody else's thoughts, do you use a male voice? Do we use a female voice? Do you have a voice with an accent? You know, what kind of speech, what kind of language? Because that might not fit your own. So the way that we decided to do that was to use text to indicate that. So you can see a little bit of that here. So what you can see is, again, it's very difficult to capture when it's, you know, it's a 360 film onto a flat screen. So the student would look around the environment, the thoughts would come, and that would be to help them to try and experience what the person would be seeing in that situation.
Just wanted to add here that sometimes simple is best. By using distinctive fonts and simple text effects, the words themselves became characters with their own personalities. Mania bounces around and is erratic, while psychosis throws the thoughts in the participant's face. Anxiety jitters across the screen, building a sense of unease, while depression fills the user's view until they can't see anything around them. While the words may sometimes have been difficult to read, this only added to the experience.
So we tried to create, there's a symptom called derailing in psychotic thought processes, where thoughts come in and then they disappear. You can't quite grasp your thoughts at the time. So we use things like timing, how long the words were on the screen for them to disappear. For the mania one, they come really, really fast. For depression, they create a block, and actually the words sit on top of each other, so you create a sense of disconnection and a sense of alienation within the social situation, which is very characteristic of people with experiencing those problems. Oh, wait a minute. I don't know if you can hear this very terribly well. I just need to warn anybody, if you're slightly easily offended, it's a bit sweary, okay? So please try not to, if you don't want to listen to sweariness, then excuse yourself. Hopefully you can hear it. So what you can see there, the girl in the red is talking, and what we've done, we did 360 audio, so you've got the sense of the psychotic voice coming from behind you, because again, that's very important to differentiate when people are hearing voices. It's not your internal dialogue. This is an externally heard experience. And quite often voices are very derogatory, they'll be instructive, those kinds of things. And we wanted to make sure that there was a sense of, is it behind me? And when you put the headsets on the students, you know when the voices are coming in, because the first thing they do is that you can see them and they start to look behind them to look for the voice. We also used a certain amount of distortion as well to try and create a little bit more drama, but again, that's when you have to kind of put the brakes on things a little bit, because our media partners kind of really wanted to recreate the Saw at this point with, you know, blood and lots of special effects, and we were like, no, actually we do need to tone this down. And I think the gentleman that raised the issue around ethics and what the risks that you're putting people at, we were very, very mindful of that. So we created this thing, sorry, wrong button, and we put it through, put it into pre-testing in our interaction lab, which we have a two-way lab that we use, and that was great because this has been a big piece of work, and to finally see it actually put into to place behind a screen and seeing it used was a lovely day. But the things that we had to really think about was whether anybody got any physical conditions. Everyone worries about the mental conditions when you're using VR headsets, but we had to be mindful of things like balance issues, visual disturbances, any kind of problems with disorientation, with seizures, pregnancy, which quite a lot of our students were pregnant, and also pre-existing mental health conditions. So what we said were to any students that if you had any of those conditions, you weren't allowed to use it. They would discuss it with me, but we didn't want to alienate people that had mental health conditions. We wanted them to be able to make the decision to participate. So if it had been anything recent and psychotic, we said no, but otherwise we were allowing people to participate. We needed spinny chairs. That's the other thing when you're using virtual reality, because if people start moving their necks and then they can't move their body with it, you're going to risk neck injuries. So we made sure that we ran it through by the legal team.
Working with colleagues from the Human-Computer Interaction Design Lab, we did some preliminary user testing with 8 students from differing disciplines. The tests were designed to replicate an early teaching plan concept with students assigned in pairs, with one student taking the experience and the others asking questions. Some discoveries seemed obvious. The more time a student repeated the experience, the less impactful they found it. Watching the experience was not as exciting as taking part in the experience. But at least no one fell over, vomited, or became psychotic.
So we developed a teaching plan around it. The students would be using the headsets as it was a co-facilitated session in groups of 6. So one of us would be in a room with the students with headsets on, and they rotated around various activities during a simulated practice session. So the VR was part of a teaching session that we developed. So how to evaluate, that was again the next question that came along. We looked at using empathy scales. We weren't hugely impressed. It had to be part of a very short, quick administered questionnaire. A lot of the empathy scales are hugely lengthy, hugely detailed, things like the Jefferson empathy scale we looked at. And a lot of them aren't necessarily entirely suited to what we wanted. So we kind of parked the quantitative analysis for now and really looked at the qualitative analysis. And we did that in 2 different ways. So we actually audio recorded with student consent whilst they were using the headsets, and we captured their responses. And then we did some follow-up small interviews, about 5 of them, individual interviews, to add a little bit more to the qualitative data and to dig down a little bit more into the responses. So these were some of the comments that came out in the qualitative data, and we felt that these were really starting to indicate that students were starting to develop this empathy towards these experiences. It must be exhausting when your body and mind is telling you to stab someone and you know that you mustn't. I might act in a drastic way. I might shout out or feel like I don't belong there. Now, if you've got someone with psychosis who's in a stressful environment, they will shout out. They will act in an erratic way. So for a nurse to be able to see somebody and say, that's because they're psychotic, it's not because they're a bad person or they're trying to harm me. It's an understanding of actually how frightened that person is and that their psychosis is part of that fear. So looking at the depression, at the end, the thoughts were blocking everything out. It shows many people can be around you, but you are still alone, which any of you who have ever suffered from depression will know that that's one of the key things, is being alone in a room full of people is one of the hardest things to deal with. You could hear what people were saying, but it was like background noise because the thoughts were taking you away. Now, if you're thinking about information giving, you don't want somebody's thoughts being taken away elsewhere. Therefore, the students were then able to think about, right, well, okay, well, how am I going to make sure that if I'm trying to give information, that that's going to be retained? It's like something we all get, but maybe in a different way, which I think was lovely because it actually said, yes, we do. Majority of us at some point in our lives are going to experience some kind of mental health difficulty, and it's not a them and us situation. And this one was very powerful, and I felt I did spend quite a lot of time with this student afterwards. Again, with our ethics approval was that if anybody raised anything during the session, that we needed to provide them support afterwards. And this student's brother had schizoaffective disorder. She said, I feel awful, my brother feels his voices, and I had no idea it would feel like this. We did it for a few minutes. I've got no idea how he coped all the time. And that's just one of those little light bulb moments that you get in terms of developing someone's empathy and understanding. So in terms of research outcomes, these were the things that we found. There was an empathic response to the VR. There was empathic understanding. The students felt it created a real-life experience, although nobody ever wanted to go to the party because it was just so horrendous. There was a lot of reflective responses. There was thinking about how nurses would respond in those situations. There was a lot of uncomfortable emotional responses. Students felt disturbed by it, they felt unsettled by it, they felt sad. These were some of the words that came out in the research. But also that it was a relatable and personal experience. They love using VR. They absolutely love it. I think anybody who's used it, it's that amazing feeling, oh, this is new. Whether that will go away through time as there's greater exposure to VR, I don't know. But at the moment, they very much enjoyed that. And they felt that it was a really useful way to develop understanding of other people. Some of the negative feedback was disorientation, so putting the headset on and then taking it off when you're finding yourself at the other end of a room was slightly disorientating, and the usual, so any of us ever know using technology in teaching, technical issues. But I was lucky enough to have one of the techs with me to keep an eye to make sure that nobody fell off the chair or anything else happened, so that was useful. Things to bear in mind, it's a very small sample. This is a prototype app. It's still very much lots and lots of room for development, which would be lovely if we could, anything comes out today to kind of think about taking those forward. But definitely we felt like proof of concept had been achieved.
Well, for me, as I'm now working in the Faculty of Engineering at Monash, I'm taking these lessons learned into a more student-led development, working not only on the design of content, but the technology itself. If you have any questions for me, you can reach me at the email address listed earlier in the presentation. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. See you later.
So, thank you very much. Sorry, I might have gone slightly over time, but any questions at all? It's at the moment it exists on only 7 very precious phones on an app. To be honest, I wouldn't want it made available at the moment. There's still so much work that it needs to be completely redone. It proved that it worked, but I don't think it's something that I would necessarily want out there just yet. So hopefully that would be my look, would be to looking at future funding to develop it further. Yeah. Sure, no problem.
On your findings at the end there, you had an exclamation mark by the video that could be improved. Why was that? What were quickly in a nutshell, what were the improvements you've made?
Because we worked with an external provider to develop the video. Sorry, these were the improvements for the video. I've forgotten already. The improvements for the video. We asked for diversity. We ended up with something that was very different. I think we would use different videos for different situations. I think using the same video and repurposing it wasn't great, but it worked for what we needed it to do. I think, and it's just kind of the background speech that goes on. The whole script needed to be rewritten. We had control over the script of the words that came onto the screen, but we handed over responsibility for the script writing for the scenario, and that was a big mistake. Yes, definitely. But we were working at the end of the year when money was running out, so it was issue. Working university funding is always the case. So, yeah.
Absolutely loved it, brilliant. But with the text, is there a risk that you're going to lose immersion? Because when I was watching that, I started just reading the text and actually experiencing that.
Yeah.
Do you disagree?
No, totally agree with you. And it was just how do you get somebody's thoughts? Because the concern was if you used audio, and if you're working around issues around psychosis, or even if you were looking at the depression, would you then think you were hearing voices because you could hear somebody else's voice? So yeah, I think maybe there's probably work to be done around actually how much do you put in without it becoming a distraction or it becoming part of the...
The audio worked really well with psychosis, but yeah, you couldn't do that for other ones.
Yeah, absolutely. But with the students, what we do is we get them to unpick what the text means. So, for example, we'll say to them, well, when you were watching the psychosis one and the words kept disappearing, what does that mean to you? What do you think how did that relate to the thought? So we try and get them to get to the point of saying, oh, yeah, that's when derailing occurs, or that's when night smooth thinking occurs. Because if you look actually at the content of these, particularly the psychosis one, it almost links, but not quite, which is characteristic of psychotic type thinking. So, sorry.
Yeah, apologies if I missed it, but did you do any quantitative data logging inside the application with respect to where this is looping around? For example, like a temporal heat map across all frames in
We did think about doing that with the interaction lab people. Money, time. I'm not a researcher. I'm just a lecturer that wanted to use a bit of VR. is really where it was at. Yeah.
I was wondering if you use spatial audio with the clip, and I wondered how that might help. So, like when you turn your head, the sound is loudest in the direction that you're facing.
Yes, with regard to using spatial audio, Leona's the technical person who's probably best able to answer that. But I do remember that there was discussions about when you move your head, it means that it would focus on different people and their voices became louder. So yeah, that's, I say I'm not the tech person. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, thank you very much.
I'd just like to thank you once again for a really interesting application of VR. You've got our heads very much in engineering, so it's fantastic to see how related, I mean, how it makes the sciences and so on much more related.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.